Well, it's quite an honor to be here today. And I had the privilege of staying backstage last hour or so to hang out with all the other speakers that will be gracing the stage today. And it's quite a group, actually. And I was thinking to myself, what makes a future teller? And is there any commonality between myself and all these other people? And they're all quite individuals, and you can tell just by meeting them that they've spent their life being themselves and leaning forward towards the future. You can see it in their posture a little bit. They kind of lean forward in their thoughts. And for me to explain the future of making and learning and talking about empathy, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my own life, because I strongly believe to have empathetic understanding of others, you need to have an empathetic understanding of yourself. So this is me in first grade, and it's not the best picture, but I can tell just by looking at it that I did not like school, and I looked lost, and I certainly was. And it wasn't until I graduated high school that my mother told me I was dyslexic. And all of a sudden, everything made sense, why I couldn't spell, why I couldn't do certain things, but I had a passion for learning and understanding that just didn't fit with the traditional society or the way that we learned. And my first piece of technology to help me was the Speak and Spell, and for those of you who ever tried one of those, that really didn't help me very much. And actually, the word dyslexic to this day is something I probably couldn't spell if I tried. But that relationship between technology, even very primitive technology, and my path to learning was a real challenge. And still today is a bit of a challenge. The way I addressed it really was to find workarounds. I found my skill sets that worked for me, which was much more of a visual, experiential learner. So I studied sculpture, and most of my pieces at the beginning were all about a manifesto of to listen to my own voice, not to listen to the voices of school and what people were telling me, this is how you learn, this is how you do things, which led me into lots of interesting experimentations and getting in trouble a lot, which I feel is actually a really great way to find the limits of what's possible. Another sculpture of mine where I was really talking about trusting your gut, and that you know, more than anything, understanding yourself and trusting your own voice and listening to your passion really is the first stepping stone to me to understanding the world around us, which is ever-changing. In 1999, I set out, after spending a lot of time in art school. I went to 4 different undergraduate schools, finally getting a degree and a master's in sculpture, where I felt like it was a huge waste of time and money, as art schools often do. But specifically, it lacked creativity, it lacked community. I used to say that there was too many artists and not enough people there. And I started with an idea of a place that could inspire creativity in everyone, that was about the beginner. It was a non-competitive learning environment where you could really explore and be yourself. And that, for me, a lot of my self-compassion and understanding came from my creative process. And the more that I was able to create freely and share that creativity with others in community was a really powerful guide for me moving forward. And as someone who was seeking an ideal school or place to learn and a master teacher, I seeked high and low for that. I never found it, and so I decided to start the school and try to become that teacher. And the machines that we worked with at the Crucible were much simpler in some ways, but still that dichotomy between human and what we've created as our tools doesn't always work for everyone. The Crucible now, while it started with a grant for $1,750 and was a very much grassroots organization, has now become the largest nonprofit industrial arts school in the nation, in the US, teaching about 8,000 people a year, and everything from welding, blacksmithing, stone carving, kinetics, electronics, machining, fire dancing, jewelry, you name it. And it's really about people collaborating on creativity. And I feel like creativity is a really critical element to moving the world forward. And it's a lot of what we sort of leave behind. And creativity and success have an interesting interaction that I'll talk about a little bit later. But at the Crucible, you're taught basic elements of how to do something safely and then unleash to chase your dreams and go from ideas to reality very quickly. There's a very strong sense of mentorship. The student-to-teacher ratio is 6-to-1, so you have experts helping you along to teach you how to do things. There's a tremendous youth program that empowers kids from ages 8 up to dive in and learn skill sets and the power of transformation of materials, using fire and electricity to transform metal and glass, things that seem so permanent in our world, but with a little bit of technique and some technology, you can really transform objects and hard materials into your ideas. It's open to everyone. It's open to teachers that are not masters, that don't have degrees, but they have a long experience and passion for teaching. There's a very large element of reaching out to kids. The Crucible stands in West Oakland, which is east of San Francisco. It's a very low-income community that doesn't have a lot of opportunities, so we did a lot of reaching out to those kids and encouraging them to be themselves and be different and express that. And so that, for me, creativity is that driving force, that first element. After 12 years at the Crucible, I decided to move on to the day, actually, and ended up at Stanford's D School, the design school, which is a really unique space, the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, part of the dream child of David Kelly, who's the founder of both IDEO and the D School. And he himself talks about empathy being the main element of design. And I would just add to his words is that to know yourself first is a really great gateway to be able to have empathetic understanding of others. And his design process, while it bases in product design, it really has expanded to ideas and experiences. That if you're going to design for someone else, you really need to know how to do that by understanding the user. And the process of design thinking, while it's got this, beautiful graphic of empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing, and a lot of this sounds very simple and like, oh, well, those are all elements, but it's amazing how little we actually do of this. Most of product design focuses on engineers and people in marketing deciding what they think the world is going to like without having that user testing. And so a lot of the teaching I do at Stanford is really about, it sounds terrible, but setting people up to fail a little bit or not to have a clear-cut answer, that it's an exploration, and that using this process along with your skill sets to break apart the concept of what the world thinks should be the answer and finding your own is really really a challenge for Stanford students a lot of times. These are people that have done very well through school, and you take them into the design school, and you put them with a diverse group of people where you're practicing radical collaboration and inclusion, and you're giving them a journey that has no prescribed end. You're taking them on an exploration. You take them out on a ledge, and they're concerned about how are they going to get a grade in this instead of focusing on the task. And so it's a challenge. I also teach design thinking in China quite a bit. And as you can imagine, it's a very challenging environment to do that. I say it's really simple. All you have to do is go against 30,000 years of cultural programming, where you don't have to worry about saving face. You want to celebrate failure. You want to talk about your feelings and emotions. Very challenging thing to do in China. It's really just the human element of creativity is often looked at and forgotten. But when I teach my students about design thinking, it's really a psychological understanding of your design challenge, of understanding, listening, imagining what they're thinking, imagining what their hopes and dreams are, watching their body language, really listening to their words, asking open-ended questions instead of directive, and the idea of need finding instead of problem solving, where you're actually open to totally changing your design challenge based on what you're hearing from your user. One of the great examples I like to talk about is a group of Stanford students went to Kenya and talked to local Maasai that were burning down their houses quite often based on kitchen fires. And so they went out there set to redesign the way that they cooked inside. Like, we're gonna make a new stove. And the question that they kept asking again and again was, when your house is on fire, what is the one thing you go back to save? And almost consistently, without question, was their papers, their version of their passport or their identity papers. And that these were usually hidden away somewhere and incredibly valuable, and if they lost those, they were pretty much without a person. They did not exist without those papers. And so the design team totally pivoted and moved away from redesigning a stove and came up with a, hello, what happened there? Anyways, they came up with a new design, which was a portable scanning truck where people could have their papers scanned and digitized and made copies of. And so their solve on that was to totally change what they were solving for. They don't care about the fires, they care about what the people in that situation were concerned about, which was their paperwork. So at the D School, they really focus about innovators, making people that can make innovations instead of the actual outcomes. It is true that sometimes students are going public with their first idea before they graduate at Stanford, which is a really challenging thing as a teacher to try to get them to show up for class, as you can imagine. But we're really aiming for empowering them as lifelong learners and passionate creators to fail fast, to succeed quicker, and really use empathy as the element of their design. While I was at Stanford, I connected with some folks at Autodesk, and if you're familiar with Autodesk, they're the makers of a lot of software from the film industry to architecture to engineering and just pretty much anything else. And their CEO, or actually past CEO now, Carl Bass, had a great saying where it was really not about the machines and the technology or the software, it's really about the people that drive innovation. And Carl's a great guy, really just a big kid that likes to make stuff, and was also brilliant at running the organization. So under Carl and some folks in the education department and applied research, I launched a Stanford initiative called the Stanford Creative Ignition Lab at Autodesk, where I brought Stanford students up from Palo Alto into San Francisco to work on some of the stuff that was happening at Autodesk, mostly in education and focused on the future of making and learning. And one of the things I focused on with the Creative Ignition Lab was this idea of we were interested in unleashing all the brilliance that the SAT doesn't measure, that the world is really focused on this book-smart, technical element of knowledge, and there's so much embodied, visual, experimental learning that happens that we don't even think about. So one of the first projects was to compare musicians and their workflow with how people worked in front of building software. And we actually did a lot of need finding with people that sat in front of a computer all day working on CAD or Inventor or whatever software and measured their sort of life experience after 8 hours of creating in front of a screen. And how many of you, after 8 hours of sitting in front of a screen, are like energized and excited versus like, say, musicians or artists or performers that do their flow. And so we strive to transform and inspire that process. So as someone who thinks about the future, I really don't like technology right now. I think it's really clunky and has a long way to go before it's really deeply tied to how humans really actually create and innovate. I think there's a lot of us that are good at it, that are closer to a mindset that understands it, and there's a lot of us that are left out. And so as someone who likes to hold the portal open for other people, I'm striving and pushing on technology to make it more inclusive, more of a, in the future, more of a democratized sort of experience, and that design and creativity can be accessible, kind of like a human right, it really seems to me. Did a lot of research with students and kids specifically, charting the path of creativity. And we found all sorts of trends talking to teachers, parents, and students. And we were really interested in this self-directed goal that we saw a lot of kids that no matter what happened, they made something and they failed and they just sort of smiled and kept going, versus other kids that got caught up on identifying that they didn't do well. And what we found is that there's this, here's a very uncreative chart talking about creativity. But what we found is that when kids reach about 8 to 10, they start having that's like sort of their peak, and they start to slow down on their creativity. And what really seems to be the case is that, their social awareness comes up, they're aware of what other people are doing, the conformity kicks in, the parents start pressuring to get good grades, the idea of success and failure comes in, and as soon as they start focusing on successful grades, they are fearful of failure. And failure and creative exploration really go hand in hand. And so what we found is that a little bit of mentoring, a little encouragement, a little bit of partnering with people, that there's the potential for that creative learning to really expand and continue throughout life. And I'm going to go back a couple, or actually you can just see on this blue line, what you don't see after 25 is that creativity for some people actually spikes up, and that people, after they've got their first job and have got out of college, want to re-explore that creativity. And that's actually why the Crucible has done so well, as people in their mid-20s to mid-40s are re-exploring their creative selves. It's also why the D-School does so well, as people come back and go, you know what, I've done the job thing, I've sat in a cubicle for too long, I want to go back and actually explore what it is that I always dreamed of. And you can see it in people that have actually, as a kid, wanted to do something and accomplished it in their lives, that they have an ease or a glow to them that other people that have never actually got to explore what it is they wanted to do have done. How many people here, can I get a show of hands, are doing what they wanted to do when they were a kid? Well, this is an awesome room, but that's still less than half. But good for you. It's never too late. So when you look at this kind of trend with creativity, and then you start applying some of the new technology that's coming out, these are incredibly powerful tools. And things like generative design, which, if you're not familiar, is totally changing the way that software is made. Generative design is not really designing where you're directing the computer to do something. You're actually now giving it parameters, and it's deciding for you different options, including materials and practices and how you can do it. This is a drone body at Autodesk where they were playing with different elements to it. So we came up with an idea around generative learning, that the same set of tools that you need when you're using this kind of technology has to expand, and that the just-in-time learning, the type of learning that happens when you're dealing with such powerful tools has to expand. And this is where the empathy and the understanding, I think the trend is the more technology you give to students, the less human interaction you have to put in, but that's really quite opposite. And I'll get back to that in a second. This is the Applied Research Lab at Autodesk. We were working with 3D metal deposition, where you're using robots and welders to build objects based in software. And you can see that you can pretty much get a welder to do all kinds of things that humans can't do. I've been welding since I was 20. I've been teaching it all through the Crucible years. And I had to try to replicate what this robot could do. It's not possible. The precision is there, and so now we applied it with intelligence, with cameras and scanners and sensors, and actually me downloading my skill as a welder to the program so that the system can actually interact with the weld and watch and see that it's starting to lean or transform it, and so that it became less about the actual making and more about the relationship of systems being able to decide when a design can be altered or changed or paused for help. This is the kind of stuff we ended up making. And it informed other things. This our vehicles, a project called Hackrod. That's a generatively designed vehicle that races and measures the stress loads and then redesigns itself. And the MX3D bridge, which is building in Amsterdam, which is actually a self-building bridge using generative design. So within that, we know that making is sort of the paramount of human existence. A lot of us are makers in here, and we define ourselves on what we make. And learning is a critical element of that. the more we make, the more we learn. There's this, obviously this tied relationship to it. When you start talking about the future of making things and tie in all this technology, I just really, every time I see it, I want to stress that the human element is really key, because as we're doing this, there's machines that are learning quicker than we are. And if you look at an education system that is still based on the college model, that's over 100 years old, it's really pretty sad, actually. And you see a lot of experimentation in junior high and high schools where they're exploring outside the confines of traditional education, but they're still caught in this college track, at least in the United States. And that it's really what is lacking in our quest towards the future. So as these two come together, you'll find that there's more research and development, which actually, in a lot of cases, adds to much more equity. The democratization of design, the future when everybody can be a designer. Just like today, when you use your smartphone and now you're a digital photographer of the world. Just think 10 years ago, you'd take a picture and how did you share it with someone? Slideshow? Now you can instantly post it to the world. Imagine a future not that far away where you can scan an object, redesign it, and produce it and share it with the world globally. That equity brings forth change agents. And you know, the one thing I saw with the people that are on the stage today is they are change agents. They are pushing that envelope. They're opening up the portal for others to engage in their creativity and look in towards the future. And when that happens, that's when the impactful design really begins. All right, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.